welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by an extremely prolific writer who is here today to talk about a novel that, in a pretty short space packs a wallop. It was a really evocative world. It is so interesting, and I am so excited to talk about it. So welcome. Could you please introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Jessup. I've been writing professionally for about over 20 years now. I don't know what that says about me. I'm old, I guess, is what it says. But most of my career is spent doing short stories, and I've gotten quite a lot of short stories published. Most of my books up until about 2020 were short story collections, things like that, or novellas. And then I had my first book published, novel published, The Silence That Binds, through Vernacular. Sadly, they're no more. But they're really great press. That's also where Natanya Barron published Queen of None first before it became this big thing through Orbit, which is really cool, I think. And then after that, I went to Underland Books, who was just a great publisher. They've been giving me awesome covers. Love the editor. Last year we did Glass House, my haunted house novel. Then this April, we did my short story collection, Skinless Man Counts to Five and Other Tales of the Macabre, which is like 20 years of my best short stories. A lot of stuff that were honorable mentions in like year's best collections, that kind of thing. So that was pretty cool. And I think 2 awards too. One of them being the Virginia Perrymore Award for Excellence in Short Stories and stuff. So that was kind of, yeah, it's kind of fun. And then this October, I've got the novel we're talking about now, Daughter of the Wormwood Star, which is, I like to roughly call my Antichrist witch cult road trip novel. That's the overview. So it sounds like a bunch of keywords you tag something with online, but it's kind of been my guiding force for it. So the basic overview, so we start off like in a small college town. The main character and her friends are trying to evade serial killers that are like running rampant in their college, the university. And there's been rumors of this girl named Angelique who just transferred there, and she's interesting to say the least. Some think that she might be the Antichrist, and some say that she was raised to believe that she was like in a Satan worshiping cult and that sort of thing. So she gathers all these girls together. They start trying to survive these serial killers. They start following Angelique, and she introduces them to devil worship and all that fun stuff. And eventually they find the reason why serial killers are coming after them. So
Yeah, it is such a ride. And something that I really love about it is that it does sort of just drop you in, like there is like the action is already kind of at full tilt by the time like right as it's opening. And I'm really curious about like how you go about openings. Like how much do you decide to reveal right away and how much do you decide to obscure for later? But when you choose like this to sort of drop the reader into the deep end right away, what motivates that choice?
okay, so yeah, it really is different for every single book. This one, I literally did want to start off with a bang. I was like, because my last book, Glass House, was a very slow build. You get to know the family, you get to know like the different things going on in the haunted house, and then eventually it starts like about halfway through, things get really crazy and weird and then creepy. And this one, I'm like, I want this to be a horror novel where people will not argue whether or not it's horror from the get-go. I want people to just be just dropped in and just have it go full tilt. And I wanted to go probably more violent than my other books, but I wanted to keep it beautiful
Mm.
uh, and make it so that it wasn't just gore for gore's sake, that kind of thing. And I wanted to talk about death, but I also kind of wanted it to be fun, which I hope comes across. It's very dark, but it should also be fun, I hope.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is fun despite being dark and pretty like explicit in the violence sometimes. And I wonder how much of that is because there is a lot of violence and it can be very shocking,
Yeah.
but the novel also kind of plays with like a sort of like dream logic and also dream pacing, you know? And I wonder if that is what, like, if that's what creates that effect. Like, how does that tie into like pacing and stuff like that for you?
That was actually a huge part of this one, was the pacing for it, because a lot of my books I don't outline, but I have like a general feeling of how it's going to be paced based on chapter length and how I start structuring the book. Usually about halfway through, I start realizing, okay, this is how it's going to be paced, this is how it's going to be going. So I go back and I kind of align everything up, and then going forward from that point, have it all move together. This one, it was kind of funny because at first I didn't want it to be too surreal, but that doesn't last very long. And I think that's just how I am as a writer. I just, I get bored if I don't have it go dreamlike and very strange. And I also at one point, like when I was writing the scenes when they're in the hospital, I started rewatching Twin Peaks.
Ooh.
And I think that kind of seeped in. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to keep going. Because at first I was like, I'm going to make this like a Paul Tremblay book. It's going to be very ambiguous. Do you know if anything supernatural is going on or not? Which I think in the first few chapters, there's that kind of vibe. It's still surreal, but it's kind of ambiguously what's real, what's not. And then that just kind of goes out the window.
Mm.
And it goes full tilt surreal, which is fun though too. I think that's where I just started really just having fun with it.
Yeah, I think it like, leaning into the surreality, if you want to call it, like lets you play with, surprising the reader because like cause and effect are not necessarily gonna like behave the way that you think they do. And it also creates like a little bit of a sort of in built-in like unreliable narrator, right? Because like who really knows what is going on? And people are doing the best they can to describe like really weird stuff, you know?
Yes, yes, that's actually that's a key part of the ambiguity. I think because the whole book, I think I want you to constantly be questioning what's real and what's not, and not just because the author is, I mean, the narrator, sorry, is very much an unreliable narrator, and the dreamlikeness does add to it because you don't know, is stuff really getting this surreal and weird? And one of the interesting things is when I was a teenager, because I was a very strange teenager, well, actually, I was more preteen, so I was like 12, 13. I was reading a one of the bibliographies of one of the Manson girls. I
Mm.
think it was Twiggy's. I'm not sure. It was like I found it at a used bookstore for like $1.25. It was published in the 70s and probably forgotten. And it was really short. And it was very strange because like she did it, she told everything very matter of factly. And then at the ending, and this stuck with me because like everything was very dark and disturbing. But at the ending, she talks about how she was in prison and literally she believed giant hands of God came down, lifted her up, and held her and forgave her. Like she honestly believed that happened. And I was just like, that's really curious. And so I kind of like, you know what? I want to see if I can do that same kind of effect here, where, I mean, this character honestly believes all this stuff is happening to her. Like there's no question in her mind that this is real. Because at the start, she does question like, what's really going on here? But then after a while, it's just, she believes it.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, like trying her best to be as reliable a narrator as possible,
Yes.
given
Yes.
the circumstances.
Given the circumstances,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. Because like after a while, it's just like, what is going on? I want the reader to constantly just feel like they're on shifting sand because there's stuff that just, okay, this is obviously real. And then other stuff where it's like, what? What? I think there's a spot. I don't want to give anything away. I don't want to spoil it. Let's just say when they actually see what's behind the jawbone door
Mm.
is where it just kind of throws reality out the window completely.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I am very excited for readers to get there,
Yes.
And
Yes.
I've been like trying to be cautious in how I talk about things because I, don't want to reveal anything. So I'm going to let you like sort of lead it with
Edge
how you
around it.
want to talk about. Yes.
Edge around it a little.
I'd love if we could talk a little bit about our narrator and
Mhm.
the knot, the group that she finds herself in as
Yes.
they're sort of taking off. I'd love if you could talk about like crafting their dynamic because they are brought together by a whole lot of stuff, right? Like magic, fate, maybe, but also like the trauma that they just lived through and like the sort of trauma bonding that happens from that. So could you talk about, yeah, what went into these characters and their dynamic?
Well, one of the key things I wanted was I wanted them to feel real and authentic. So I pulled a lot from people I knew from college, things like that. And I pulled a lot of like my daughter is now like in her 20s. So I looked at her and her friends and things like that. And I was like trying to remember my own time period. So I wanted to and make sure their voices sounded correct and accurate. And then from there, I knew that I wanted her to. There's something I don't think anyone talks about when it comes to things like found family as well as family groups, being in relationships, and that's there's always a constant push and pull with being wanting to be true to yourself and wanting to be part of something else. And it's like this constant pull and push because you don't want to be lonely, but you also don't want to give up too much of yourself to be part of the group. And that was like a very important thing for this for me is like she wants to be part of this group. She wants to be with them. And yeah, there's the trauma bonding that keeps them there. There's all this stuff. Like, I don't think if it wasn't for everything they'd gone through, they would have been friends, except for her and Petal, but that's a different thing. No spoiler there. But like, there's that thing where she wants to be part of it. Everyone feels that too. When they're not part of the group, they feel like this loss of companionship, but a regain of themselves. And I wanted to do that with the narration itself using like a first person plural and having constantly going back between that and first person, depending on how she feels, whether she's part of the group or whether she's outside of the group, that sort of thing, and the control they have over her. Because at first there's no control. She wants to be part of it. And then it just kind of becomes a push and a pull. And I didn't want to go the normal cult route where, you have like the charismatic leader that becomes bad and then like starts tormenting, torturing everybody. I wanted to do something that was more like the group turns on him, that kind of or her. The group turns on her and kind of wrests control from her. And I thought that was actually pretty terrifying too. And it's in a different way, because I want people to constantly be asking themselves, well, is Angelique who she says she is, who everyone thinks she is? Is she actually that special? Is she just a pawn, or what's going on here? I wanted that because for me, that's scary, not knowing, like as a reader, what's going on and trying to figure it out, but also fun,
Yeah, a vicarious kind of fun because we get to see the narrator go through this, which would be really horrifying to actually go through. So, but
Oh,
there's
yes.
like a lot of, really interesting playing with like subjectivity and also how your own perspective can sort of be influenced by like groupthink or,
Yes.
really consistent, charismatic people. Your mention of cults and it really not being about like culty type things
Mhm.
leads to my question about genre, because I love to ask people about how they approach genre. I feel like you're playing with a lot of them here, like a couple of different types of horror, but even beyond horror, there's like some dark fantasy elements and sort of like in a very weird way, a coming of age too.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'd love if you could talk about how you approach genre, like, because I always kind of like to think of it as like a buffet, that you can take little things from. And
I do like that. I like that idea a lot. And also like when I first came to genre again, because like when I was in college and right out of college, I was very much a snooty, like pseudo intellectual, and I was just trying to write literature, And then I discovered China Mieville, Jeff Vandermeer, Kelly Link, and all those writers that kind of just said like genres just like this big soup. And we can make it as literary and as weird as we want. We can throw in everything. There's no boundaries. And that was so appealing to me. And I tend to do that for my own work too. And especially with horror, because I love so many different subgenres of horror. And I really honestly, I think dark fantasy and fantasy itself is like horror is like a subgenre of fantasy for me. I know some people disagree with that, especially because like there's that whole thing in the 90s where the influence of Silence of the Lambs moved everything more towards a realistic kind of horror, and slashers were so big because, well, it's so cheap to make them, and that kind of thing. But for me, maybe it's because I grew up on like reading classic horror, like M.R. James, Mackin, Poe, Lovecraft, and also like Stephen King, Clive Barker. It's always been fantasy for me, and so I love just putting that in there. And this one I thought was funny because when I wrote fantasy, because I've done fantasy short stories, and I had a fantasy novel I wrote a while back, but it's still in a trunk waiting for me to actually make it, better. Because it's, you finish a book and you're like, nah. Um,
yeah.
this, I decided to go with rules for the magic, a magic system, which I never do. And that's not normal for horror. Horror has rules for like monsters and things like that, but they don't really have like rules for the magic system and like why it works and how it works. But this one I wanted like to make it more like an epic fantasy with how the magic works, the psychic powers, so to speak. and I wanted that to play into the narrative. And so that was, I thought, that was kind of fun. And I wonder if people noticed that I pulled the terminology from Stephen King books.
Ooh. You know what? That's really funny because I was thinking as we were just talking about dark fantasy and
Yeah.
you mentioned Stephen King, I'm like, oh, like the Gunslinger series like plays with like similar like dream logic-y type feelings like in certain places, you know, obviously sometimes it's also very realist when they're different worlds and stuff like that.
Yes.
But yeah, I really like that idea of, you know, yeah, using like a sort of super articulated magic system from like a sort of more traditional fantasy and sort of putting that into like this nightmare horror.
Yeah, nightmare system. And it's funny too, because like, yeah, even though they've got that, it's so surreal of a story that it just kind of somehow works together.
Mhm.
And anyone that's a fan of Firestarter and Carrie will probably notice the terms that I use for their psychic abilities slash magic powers. So
Very cool.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so much fun. Could we talk a little bit about Angelique and sort of what went into crafting her? You know, because there's all sorts of groupthink and sort of like culty type behaviors, let's say at work. Like she's combating these like very nihilistic cultist of a kind. But also people accuse her of being a cult leader, like grasping at like what little they know of her from like what they've seen. So yeah, could you talk about like balancing those tendencies and like what went into sort of shaping her like contradictions, let's say?
Well, okay. So originally I've been wanting to write an Antichrist story since I was like 10 or 11. And I was in a huge kick of Rosemary's Baby. I read Rosemary's Baby, the book. And then I read because there was a used bookstore down the street from my house. So that's where I got most of my books, that in the library. But the library, it was a small town library. I think there was like a total of 2,000 people living there. And so like they didn't have everything. So mostly I got it from this used bookstore. And they had The Omen 2, the novelization, but not the first one. So I read that and then I saw the movies and things like that. And I was like, oh, I want to write something like this, an Antichrist story. And it's been in the back of my head since then. And then last year I was like, I'm going to write it. I'm going to do it. And so I had a bunch of failed attempts where I was trying to get the character. And originally it was going to be like an androgynous character. And then I was like, well, I'm going to go for like a David Bowie kind of character. And then I want to do somebody that was like um overtly queer, that kind of thing. And then like I just couldn't get into the story. I just couldn't get into it. And then I was thinking about, well, we don't see a female Antichrist like in anything, really. I think there's been maybe one in some B movie somewhere. And I know in the final Omen, they hint at one.
Hmm.
But I was like, well, I should do that. That's interesting. And I've always wanted to do, when I want to do my Antichrist story, I didn't want to do like the sequel to Rosemary's Babies. They always have her be like, in the later Omen movies, it's always, they're going to be rich and powerful politicians. I wanted to be like on the ground, like a cult of like misfits and weirdos, because I mean, we've seen Anton LaVey and all them, like, actual devil worshippers are not rich and powerful people. They're just kind of freaks and weirdos. So I wanted that to go into two. And I started thinking about like, well, what would she be like? And I like went through different like ideas of how she would look and how she'd behave. And then I was like, I kept trying to start the story with them meeting her in different ways. One of my favorite ones actually was them noticing uh, a comet coming down and she being like in the side of this meteorite that they find. That was kind of interesting, but still I couldn't get it to work because that's a reference to something in the Bible, something about Satan falling down from heaven like a lightning bolt.
Hmm.
And I was like, that's kind of neat. But that didn't work. And so I was just sitting there one day and I'm thinking, I'm like, well, what if I have just a bunch of people gossiping about her? And so I started writing that. And it wasn't originally I was going to originally describe the scene and have people talking like in normal fiction, but then it just kind of went without like any breakup. It was just like the conversation, just straight conversation. Well, you've read it and
Yeah.
people here will probably read it too. It's hard to explain. My editor called it headless chats,
Yeah.
which is an interesting way to put it. But that's when I discovered what her character was like, was when I was like having these people talk about her. And originally the book was going to start with that and end with one of those.
Hmm.
And then when I got like 6 chapters in, I was like, no, I can do something really fun here. I could do like every 6 chapters have another one of these and have it split up into different episodes and have it be like an old mini series, like an old horror mini series, like in my head, like this old TV horror mini series like It or Salem's Lot or that sort of thing. So
I do really like that because like yeah, I love the interventions of the group chat because it or like the the talking heads or the
yes,
headless talking heads
headless chats. Yeah.
headless chats. Because it sort of, functions as a kind of like Greek chorus on like what we're reading sometimes.
Yes, that's actually on purpose. Yes.
Oh, nice. Yeah, like it's good
Yes.
at creating suspense and tension too. Yeah, it's there's a really nice like and it's bewildering. I think it's part of like why I feel like at the top you're just dropped in with like and you're
Yes.
you're kind of looking for air. And I like that feeling at the start of a novel, really kind of puts you on your toes.
Yes. Yes. It's kind of being shoved into it. And I just really wanted to do that with this one. Like we talked before, like I wanted to just have it go full bore right away. And I'm glad that came across because that's great. Because I didn't want this, I wanted this one to have like no room for error. You're just constantly moving forward. It's constantly just what's going on. And yeah, because when I actually started repeating the headless chats as they were, the third time I was like, this is like a Greek chorus. And then I just kind of leaned into it. And I also had fun with it because they kind of make snarky comments on everything that's going on, which, I'm hoping some people aren't going to like, well, this is dumb. Like, come on, just go with it. It's fun.
Yeah, and it's great, because I think that like, you can use moments of levity like that to sort of like loosen tension, which then lets you like drop readers on their heads again, like
Yes.
it's really an interesting way to sort of also allow the pacing to do what it does. So
Yeah.
yeah, this book is so interesting. And I'm curious, like what's on your horizon? It sounds like you're constantly writing like a million things at once. So
I've got one book coming out next year I can't talk about. That's Hush Hush. I'll probably be able to hopefully talk about it in maybe a few weeks. But I also have in October another book from Underland. That'll be my fourth book through them. That one's called Cancer Eats the Heart. And it's about people who are disabled and chronically ill turning to vampirism to heal themselves, so to speak. So, and a lot of people, when I tell people about this, especially people who like have multiple sclerosis or chronically ill or like suffering from cancer, oh, I would do that in a heartbeat. I would do that right away. I'm like, well, that wouldn't make much of a book though, would it?
yeah.
I'm like, no, in this one, you can't just like drink like bags of blood you steal from the hospital. You actually have to drink the blood near death. And that's where they get the powers from to heal themselves. So it's like they have to murder, so there's a lot of complex things going on there. It's also what it's my third book in my Hungry Void trilogy. And the reason why I call it that is because each book kind of deals with existential terrors. Like in this book, the cult of serial killers worship a void, and worship nothingness and death. In that book, that also comes into play again, connected in ways with this one, as well as connected with Glass House from last year. So they're all kind of enmeshed, but they're not direct sequels. So John Carpenter did this with what he called his Apocalypse trilogy, which was The Thing, Prince of Darkness, and In the Mouth of Madness. Fulci did it with the City of the Dead trilogy, no, Gates of Hell trilogy, that's what it was called. And what's his name? Argento did it with Suspiria, Mother of Tears, and Inferno, the Three Mothers trilogy. So they're not direct sequels, but they're kind of thematically all connected.
Interesting. Oh, cool. Yeah, there's the I guess not pure horror, but the Cornetto trilogy of no.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
There is, I think there is horror in each of those though.
That's
Like,
yeah.
yeah, like Hot Fuzz seems like it's a cop movie, but it ends like a folk horror movie.
That's yeah, there are definitely elements of like the Wicker Man and stuff going on
Yes,
there. So,
yes. And what's that other one that was really big? Kill List. It's a
yes.
lot like that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. So this has been a really fascinating chat, and I'm so glad that you shared this book with me and that, yeah, we got to
Of
chat about
course.
it here. Thank you.
Yeah, this is so much fun. Anytime you want me to come back on, I'll happily come back on. I love doing these things.
Oh, great. Okay, I'm going to hold you to that because, yeah, we'll definitely talk about
Yeah.
Cancer Eats the Heart because I want to ask you about titles too because you're very good at titling things.
Oh, yes, I
Yeah.
actually have a lot to talk about that. I did a whole class on it for Apex.
Oh, wow. Okay, so yeah, I'm
Yes.
putting a pin in that for next time. That's great. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, listeners, it's your turn now. Please check out Daughter of the Wormwood Star. It is an absolutely beautiful read, and by the time that you hear this, it will be out in the world, so go pick it up. All right, thanks so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.